Top of the morning to you, and glad for your company on our special coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Olumide Macaulay. The headlines. At least 4 people killed in missile strikes in western city of Lviv. Man dies after detonating explosive device at court in Ukrainian capital. Plus, wheat market in full swing in Russian-controlled Ukraine as grain deal hangs in the balance. Thank you for joining us. 4 people have been killed and several others injured following a Russian missile strike in the western city of Lviv today. A child is among at least 32 people injured after the missile directly hit an apartment building, destroying the 3rd and 4th floors. People are still trapped under the rubble, and rescue efforts are ongoing. So far, 7 people have been rescued and 64 evacuated, according to Ukraine's Minister of Internal Affairs, Ihor Klimenko. President Vladimir Zelensky offered his condolences to the victims' families and vowed to respond to the attack. Drone footage shows the scale of destruction after the Russian missile attack hit an apartment building in the western Ukrainian city of Lviv, killing at least 4 people. The video, a wide, curving 4-story apartment building with parts of the upper floor missing or in rubble, rescuers stand atop the building, searching through the debris for survivors and casualties, while some people are also seen on the street walking past the mangled vehicles covered in ash. Social media posts from officials followed widespread air alerts across Ukraine and reports of cruise missiles entering Ukrainian airspace. A man who detonated an explosive device at a court in the Ukrainian capital died yesterday after barricading himself inside part of the building. 2 members of a special rapid response security forces unit were hurt during attempts to bring the man under control at the court in the center of the capital. 2 loud noises were heard during the incident. Briefing reporters at the scene, officials say the man had presumably died from the explosive device. Writing on the Telegram messaging app, he says, according to preliminary information, he blew himself up. He identified the suspect as Ihor Homenyuk and said he'd been attending a hearing as a suspect in connection with the deaths of 4 Ukrainian National Guardsmen in 2015. After the hearing, the man had first locked himself in a bathroom and tossed an explosive device at 2 guards. Stopped from leaving the building by officers firing into the air, he barricaded himself into another room, refusing to negotiate with officials, and then threw another device at 2 officers who were injured. An investigation is on to determine how he had been in possession of explosives in the court. Earlier, police had rushed to the district court in Kyiv after receiving reports of the explosion, which city authorities said may have been caused by a man detonating an explosive device. The Kyiv City Military Administration said the explosion took place at 5:20 p.m. in the court at the center of the capital. The United Nations is making every effort to ensure that the Black Sea grain deal and a memorandum of understanding to facilitate the access of Russian fertilizer and other products to global markets are extended. United Nations Trade Chief Rebecca Greenspan says this while addressing reporters in Geneva. Russia has been undecided whether to extend the Black Sea grain deal. Under that arrangement, Russia guaranteed the safety of grain ships heading to and from Ukrainian ports through waters it controls. Now, when it was signed in July 2022, the United Nations and Russia also signed a memorandum of understanding committing the UN to facilitate unimpeded access of Russian fertilizers and other products to global markets.
And let's remember that there were two agreements. There was the Black Sea Initiative for the exports of grain from Ukraine to global markets, and the MOU with the Russian Federation is signed between the Russian Federation and the UN to foster the unimpeded exports of food and fertilizers from the Russian Federation also to global markets. And we need both to continue bringing prices down and have stable markets of food and fertilizers in the world. The United Nations remains committed to making every effort for the continuation of the agreements. They remain our main concern, and we hope that we can ensure their extension for the benefit of the most vulnerable countries and the most vulnerable people. But the Russian delegation was already here, and we will consider, yes, going to Moscow in the days that are left, but that has not been confirmed yet.
While Hungary has hosted Russia's health minister on a rare visit by a member of the Russian cabinet to an EU and NATO member state, with Budapest saying it wanted to keep communication channels open. Hungary, under nationalist Prime Minister Viktor Orban, is the only member of the EU and NATO alliance that still maintains close relations with Moscow after Russia invaded Ukraine last year. Now, Hungary still receives most of its oil and natural gas from Russia, while saying it's trying to diversify sources of supply, even as the rest of the EU has largely halted Russian imports. It's also been disclosed he expects that Russia's nuclear energy agency, Rosatom, will build 2 new reactors at Hungary's Paks nuclear power plant by 2030 and 2031, as agreed under a 2014 contract that has so far met with major delays. Russia has been prevaricating on whether to extend the Black Sea grain deal, while the United Nations is pledging to make every effort to prolong the pact before it expires on July the 17th. Earlier in May, Russia's agriculture minister, Dmitry Patrushev, told the Grain Forum that the harvest in Russia, which for Russian officials includes 4 unilaterally annexed regions of Ukraine, Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson, is forecast to reach 123 million tons by the end of the year, 78 million tons of it being wheat. Amidst efforts to overcome opposition from Turkey, U.S. President Joe Biden showed his support for Sweden's entry into NATO in talks with the Swedish Prime Minister Ulf Kristersson at the White House. President Biden leaves on Sunday on a 3-nation trip centered around the NATO summit in Vilnius, Lithuania. There are doubts that Turkey will lift its opposition in time to allow NATO leaders to welcome Sweden into their ranks at the summit. Now, Mr. Kristersson thanked President Biden for the invitation and said Sweden highly appreciates President Biden's support for NATO membership.
Well, Mr. Prime Minister, it's great to see you. You're a valued friend, and it's an honor to welcome you to the White House. And Sweden is a capable and committed partner. Together, we're preparing a relationship for even further, including advancing the bilateral partnership agreement we're talking about. But we're also prepared for the NATO summit next week, and I want to reiterate, the United States fully supports Sweden's membership in NATO. And the bottom line is simple. Sweden is going to make our alliance stronger and has the same value set that we have in NATO. And really anxiously looking forward for your membership. And with that bilateral relationship, Sweden and the United States are taking on the challenges that matter most to our people, from taking on the climate crisis to preserving a free and open Indo-Pacific. So across the board, we seem to be in agreement on almost everything. And we're stepping up to protect our shared democratic values, including providing security and humanitarian assistance to the people of Ukraine. The generosity of the Swedish people has been extreme. You've done a great deal as a brave people in Ukraine defend themselves against Russia's brutality.
Thank you so much, Mr. President. Thank you so much. I really do appreciate to be here. Thanks for the kind invitation to come here. It's highly valued for us. I believe that Sweden and the US, we share so many values and priorities since long, but not least right now. That goes for how to handle the war in Ukraine. I thank you for your leadership, the transatlantic unity that you have made so much to establish. That goes also to how to tackle the climate crisis, mitigating climate change. That goes for handling in a transatlantic way the challenges that China creates for democracies. And I also would like to say that we highly appreciate your strong support for Sweden's NATO accession. That means a lot to us. We do seek common protection, but we also do think that we have things to contribute with, to be a security provider for the whole of NATO. So
that's clear.
I very much look forward to our talks here today. Thank you so much.
I'm looking forward to this getting finished because you're an extremely valuable and capable partner.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Prime Minister of Sweden, Ulf Kristersson, and President Joe Biden of the United States. Russia has opened a criminal case after a prominent female journalist and a lawyer were brutally attacked in the Russian Republic of Chechnya. The Russian Investigative Committee says the investigation team is currently conducting a set of investigative action and search measures aimed at establishing individuals involved in that crime and all the circumstances surrounding the incident. Yelena Milashina, a well-known journalist for the Novaya Gazeta newspaper, was traveling to the Chechen capital Grozny from the local airport with Alexander Nemov, a lawyer, when they were attacked a day earlier. The two were beaten and threatened with guns, and both are now in a Moscow hospital. Now let's speak with researcher of the Institute for Security Studies in Pretoria, South Africa, Mr. Dennis Weaver, who's speaking to us virtually from Pretoria. Good morning and welcome to the program.
Good morning.
It's a classic tale of death from the skies. In Lviv, where 4 people have died, unfortunately, civilians it appears to have been. And you look up expecting to see the sun or the moon, but instead you see this rain of missiles, however they appear. Should there be concern now that most of the higher percentages of the casualties that are suffered by Ukrainians in areas such as Kyiv and Lviv are from the skies? Maybe that's why Lithuania also has purchased on behalf of Ukraine and is donating some sort of sophisticated air defense system, which they will deliver in about 3 months, as the NATO summit is due to be held in Vilnius in Lithuania next week. Should the Ukrainians pay more attention to their domestic security away from the front lines of the war?
Well, in that sense, the situation hasn't changed since the start of the war. The continuous missile barrages that Russia launches at Ukraine target primarily civilian targets and just cities in Ukraine, and that has been the case for a long time. I mean, it has been a problem to such a degree that even some Russian commentators questioned the strategy, saying that these missiles could have been used for military targets, but instead they're being used to target what seems to be, or at least that's the perception, that seems to be targeting civilian population. More so, if you look at these missile strikes, one cannot avoid but the fact that the residential buildings are being struck at night, and obviously at night is when people go to sleep and they would be at home, and then during the day the public spaces are being struck, and it happened on so many occasions that it's hard to say that this is just a coincidence. So in terms of the air defense, however, the situation is quite difficult. Protecting the airspace around these cities is a very challenging task. It's not only very expensive, because these systems are very expensive, the air defense systems, but also there are so many ways to overcome the air defense. Even in a city like Kyiv, we see every now and again a successful strike, even though most missiles and drones are being shot down. So it's a challenge, but the goal of this strategy from the Russian side is not clear. And as I mentioned, it was questioned even by the Russian commentators themselves. Perhaps the idea is that through terror, the Ukrainian population will be more inclined to seek a peaceful solution. Certainly, this was part of a strategy last year when General Surovikin became the head of the special military operation in Russia. He publicly stated that they will launch a campaign of terror. You may remember they targeted civilian infrastructure related to energy and water. So that seems to be the problem, most certainly, and it's not a problem that will be easily resolved, because the air defense systems are scarce and they're very expensive, and it's extremely difficult to protect these civilian targets.
Saying General Surovikin, you just mentioned, appears to be MIA, and no one seems to know where he is, apart from the defense ministry in Russia, who are not telling. But that brings us to another entirely different situation. Because of the way he has been made to step aside, such a high-ranking member of the Russian military, does this speak of any sort of dissent or disloyalty amongst the top brass of Russia's military hierarchy? Is it possible that there are people who do not support President Putin's regime in this and propositions in this special military operation, as they call it?
Well, that was one of the most interesting outcomes of the mutiny that happened recently in Russia. Not just the fact that it happened in itself was a great surprise to I think many experts, but also the fact that Wagner Group was their march was almost entirely unopposed. They met no resistance on their way from the front lines to Rostov-on-Don in Russia, and then once capturing Rostov-on-Don to Moscow, they stopped 200 kilometers away from Moscow. And a number of commentators actually did point to the fact that they didn't meet any resistance outside of Russian Air Force that was engaged in trying to stop them, is definitely a very concerning sign for Putin. Surovikin himself, on the day of the mutiny, released a statement where he condemned Prigozhin's actions, but at the same time there were some reports circulating that Surovikin might have been aware of this mutiny being planned, and in fact he might have been groomed to become the next minister of defense in Russia if Prigozhin's actions were successful. But it seems that in the last moment he got cold feet and pulled out, and that was one of the reasons why, or one of the suggested reasons why Prigozhin ended up calling off his march in Moscow. So I think it's a very fair assessment to say that Prigozhin's actions actually received an alarming level of support, definitely alarming for Putin. There were videos from the Rostov-on-Don where the general public were cheering and celebrating Wagner. We know for a fact that a number of soldiers released videos in support of Wagner and criticizing the Ministry of Defense. There is definitely it is a fair assessment to say that this is a very troubling situation for Russia, and that if something similar were to happen, or a different general were to decide to march in Moscow, we may see a very different outcome for Putin, and it should be a great concern for him.
Indeed, you mentioned how they'd met no resistance on that march at the outset. If you remember, that's how the Germans marched into Austria without firing a shot and took over the whole country. But in this case, these are Russians, and possibly the audacity of it had everybody in shock and they couldn't move. But speaking of the defense ministers and the top brass of Russia, it brings to mind now an incident that occurred at the Boris Yeltsin Museum, which is a museum in honor of Boris Yeltsin somewhere in Russia, where they put out a statement from that facility sort of not supporting the Russian invasion of Ukraine. To that end, an investigation was ordered into that particular facility called the Boris Yeltsin Center, and they say they're trying to find out if there's treason being involved of some sort. But the interesting thing is, the steering committee member of that particular building, where there's treasonable charges of some sort being investigated, happens to be Sergei Shoigu, the defense minister. He's one of the steering committee members of that facility. So it's interesting. I just thought I should mention that, it's not, we can't say for a fact that any dissent in Russia is obvious enough to affect the Putin regime, but is there a possibility that there's an undercurrent of that sort of dissent?
I think the link between Shoigu and the former president, the late president Boris Yeltsin, it's a historic link. I mean, Shoigu is not a military man. He is an engineer by training. He started his career in politics as the head of an agency that was responsible for disaster management. And he was quite a close ally of Boris Yeltsin. What is interesting, however, and something you pointed at, is that in Russia, if you are protesting, if you go out and protest against the war or Putin, there's a very good chance that you will be trialed for treason, and you may get an actual conviction. So you can go to jail for a number of years. Whereas with Prigozhin, although it was labeled as treason, not only was he released to go to Belarus, but also his assets that were originally frozen were actually returned to him, and these are millions of rubles that he now will receive that were originally frozen. So it seems that if you are protesting peacefully or making a statement against the war, you may hear from the law itself, but if you are marching with armed men towards Moscow, there is a good chance that you can get away with it. And I think that's another signal to perhaps somebody in Russia to say that if it's negotiating may be problematic, but if you actually show force, there are some concessions that you can get out of it.
Away from that, but by the way, did you notice that, is it just me, or does Sergei Shoigu have a passing resemblance to late Boris Yeltsin?
Perhaps.
You might want to put those pictures and spot the difference. But that aside, let's finally ask you concerning the Black Sea grain deal. Any hope of it being continued after the July 16th, I believe, expiration or 18th of the deal from Russia? Russia seems like they're not going to stick to it. They're going to pull out. Your thoughts?
Well, this is not the first time we're seeing the situation unfold. In fact, ever since the grain deal was reached last year, every time the deadline was approaching for the deal to be restarted, Russia threatened to pull out. And it's essentially a negotiation tactic that they're using. Essentially what they're saying is that if you don't give us what we want, we will pull out from the grain deal, and then you will see the results of it, most notably, of course, in Africa. And I think African states are quite aware of some of the implications of Russia pulling out of the grain deal. So I would take it seriously, but at the same time, I do think that there's a very good chance that Russia will continue with the grain deal. In a way, it's a double act in the sense that on one hand, yes, Russia can use food security as leverage to achieve some of its objectives, and I believe currently the European Union is discussing removing sanctions on one of the banks associated with grain and fertilizers as a way of ensuring that the deal goes through. But of course, that also helps Russia out. But on the other hand, Russia is in a position where if they pull out of the grain deal, it would be very difficult to explain it to the partners in Africa. And of course, the Africa-Russia summit is coming up end of July. So I think it is fair. It's almost safe to say that the deal will be continued, but it's also obvious that Russia is using this and food security as a way of pressuring African states and the world to put pressure on Ukraine to make concessions. And just a final point on that is even though the fertilizers are exported from Russia, a lot of them were exported from Ukrainian ports. And I believe one of the challenges is that Ukraine refuses to export Russian fertilizers from its ports, which is one of the challenges in this negotiation, and something Russia wants to push through.
Yes, they say they're not holding up their own end of the bargain for unimpeded access for Russian products and fertilizer to global markets. Thank you so much, Mr. Denis Riva, for your insights and information and your thoughts on these issues. Mr. Denis Riva, researcher at the Institute for Security Studies in Pretoria, South Africa.
Thank you for having me.
After the break, United Nations Security Council calls out Russia for killing children in Ukraine. Please stay with us. Welcome to the second half of today's coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. The UN Security Council has had a debate on the latest Children and Armed Conflict report, which now includes Russian forces after the invasion of Ukraine. Special Representative of the Secretary General for Children and Armed Conflict, Virginia Gamba, said that in 2022, the UN verified 27,180 grave violations against children throughout the world. During the meeting, Violeta, a 17-year-old Colombian girl, addressed the Council for the first time in its nearly 7 decades of history. Representatives from the US and the UK called out Russian armed forces and affiliated groups for killing 136 children in Ukraine in 2022, according to the report. Russia's representative to the United Nations, Vasily Nebenzia, denied the accusation and said the West and the Secretary General are carrying out a dirty information campaign against the Russian Federation.
$27,180 grave violations against 18,890 children were verified by the United Nations last year. These include 2,880 violations that were late verified. 8,630 children were either killed or maimed. 7,622 children were recruited and used, and 3,985 children were abducted. These 3 violations remain the ones verified at the highest level, and all of them increased in 2022. 8,890 children were affected last year, and yet their stories are not told. Despite progress in some situations, grave violations against children continue to go unpunished, and perpetrators are unchecked by the national and international legal systems. I would like to underscore that the main perpetrators of the killing and maiming of children, attacks on schools and hospitals, and the denial of humanitarian access in 2022 were the armed and security forces of governments. And these are governments whose primary responsibility is to ensure the protection of civilians, including children.
Peace is not created by signing a paper with certain groups. Peace is made in the territory. Peace is preserved by all of us, and it is necessary that we all work for it. It is also very important to work from the base, working from childhood, adolescence, and youth, because a country that does not allow its children, adolescents, and youths to work on peace building and peace processes is a country that condemns itself to a future of war.
Italian and Bulgarian troops participated in a NATO-organized drill on Wednesday in northwestern Bulgaria. The drill, which took place on Wednesday, was the final stage of the Enhanced Vigilance Activity 23 exercise. The NATO multinational brigade under Italy's command participated in the military drill, gathering approximately 1,100 personnel from Bulgaria, Italy, Greece, Albania, North Macedonia, and Montenegro.
We need to reinforce our eastern flank, and we are just trying to cooperate, whoever is right in the front line. So it is something, it is a must. It is something that moral, we feel obliged to do that, and we are happy to do that, of course.
Now, Poland and Italy believe Ukraine must receive real security guarantees ahead of a NATO summit where Kyiv hopes to get a strong signal that it will be able to join the alliance in future. The Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni, reiterated that Italy will keep giving all-round support to Ukraine for as long as necessary, and says this also applies to the upcoming Vilnius summit. Meloni has been a staunch supporter of Kyiv, despite some misgivings about among her conservation coalition allies, and in the past have been close to Russian President Vladimir Putin. The Polish Prime Minister says the two countries' views were in line on Ukraine. We now bring on board Mr. Oluseyi Adeyemo, public affairs analyst who speaks to us virtually from here in Lagos, southwest Nigeria. Thank you so much for being with us, making out the time to be with us this morning.
Olumide, thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
So we just saw in the last story but one, the NATO drill with Italy and Bulgaria. Now, Admiral Rob Bauer, who happens to be a top NATO operative, says that, or leader, says that they should not, and NATO are not, and should not take, and anyone shouldn't take Russia for granted or underestimate Russia at this stage of the war, in spite of the seeming losses they have incurred and the seeming non-progressive position that has been taken concerning their invasion of Ukraine. He says that historically speaking, Russia has been known to bounce back, and that NATO is taking Russia not at face value on their position so far, but at historical value, as though they haven't lost a single man or lost a single weapon. Is he correct? Is Russia as formidable as it was before, or is there a danger that they'll become underestimated because of their lack of evidential gains?
In my opinion, I think both sides have been as careful as they can. And what I mean by that is, I think Europe has been very careful. I think they've not looked at the fact that there have been some gains, there have been some caving in the area, on the internal area of Russia. I think if one had looked at that, I believe that by now there have been moved to sort of move on to Russia. But I think they've been careful. They're not taking the fact that there's a cave-in on the side of Russia for granted, and they've not moved in as people thought they would. I think also Ukraine has also been very careful, because the truth of the matter is one had thought that because of the mutiny, Ukraine will have moved in more than they have done because they're careful. I also believe that Russia has also been careful in the way they've managed this. Truth of the matter is, there are all sorts of school of thought. Some people believe that Russia is just doing or playing a game of communication, that they are not as formidable as they seem to be. Some people believe that Russia is not as strong, and that this mutiny has shown that everybody is not on the side of Putin. But again, I believe that Russia have done a good job in the way they've managed their communication, in the way they have shown the rest of the world that you cannot just move on to us or move it into us. So, in my opinion, I think everyone on both sides and all the sides, Europe, Ukraine, Russia, have been very, very careful. This is not the kind of war anybody can sit anywhere and say this is the way it will go. Because truth of the matter is nobody's sure of anything. And I think that's why everyone has been very careful in the way they've behaved and sort of moved in or moved on in the war so far.
The last time this was in fiction, in a movie where Arnold Schwarzenegger lost a loved one, and it was called Collateral Damage. He went stir crazy, he went haywire, and took out all his enemies. That's art, but at times life imitates art. In the case of the United Nations, where there is much ado, and rightfully so, about the death of these children for whom Russia is being accused, there are cases where Ukraine has also been identified in the same reports of having been guilty of the same thing, that is, Ukrainian troops of killing or being in situations where children were killed. And to further afield, and this was also in the report, critics say, what about situations in the West Bank and in Israel where children were killed, and those purported to be responsible were not included in this report for sanctions to be placed against them. So what's your position on the death of these children, and should this also bring us to a position where these countries come together to halt hostilities so these sorts of casualties aren't recorded?
First, it is very, very unfair and wrong that children are dying and that we have civilian casualties. Ordinarily, wars is meant to be between armies. But unfortunately, some people have also said that this is a classic example of the war of now. Some people have even said maybe it's a master class of what the contemporary war will be like. One that fighting will be going on in the air, one that all sorts of very, very advanced ammunitions and weapons of war will be deployed. And so it's a new thing. It's something that has not been tried before. And it's almost impossible that you are deploying your weaponry, from the air, and you expect that it would be tailor-made and it will go to hit the exact target that you expect. So unfortunately, you will have casualties like this. Again, I'd like to repeat and be emphatic about the fact that it is wrong. Children must not pay this price. Civilians must not pay this price. It is not something that should be allowed. But again, I'll go back to my first answer. Everybody that is involved in this war or stakeholders in this war are being careful, because you then can do things like you will have done it ordinarily, because it is the new kind of war. It's something that has not happened before, and everyone is being careful because you don't want a situation that this will graduate or move into something we all cannot handle. And I believe that this is diplomatic deployment at its best. Everyone is being diplomatic. Everyone is being careful. People are not just doing things that they would, that they would ordinarily have done. People are just not, like we expect them to do. Yes, it's being taken to the floor at the UN. It's being discussed. I can assure you that decisions that we take in will not likely meet the expectation of all of us, because they will not take the kind of speedy decision we will expect them to take, because it's a very, very sensitive situation that we all have in our hands, and we all must be sensitive to that fact and be careful the kind of decision that we take, so that we do not allow this to culminate into something that would spiral into a global disaster.
Yes, but Mr. Adeyemo, what is wrong with calling for an armistice? Because for the exact reason of the death of these children, that's one life less on this earth. And the killing of the popular novelist who's well known, so that puts a more of a human quotient to that matter. Victoria, the novelist who was killed in Kramatorsk as a result of the air raids, of the missile strikes from Russia, that these parties should call for some sort of ceasefire, some sort of armistice for the now. Although the argument has been, in the case of Ukraine, they don't want Russia to consolidate on their position and stay in their keep occupying Ukrainian territory while a ceasefire is being called for.
Like you and I, we all expect that the rest of the world will move on to talking and being more assertive in their demand and what should be done at this time, so that we can have peace. But like I said, and I want to reiterate that, the fact that everyone is being cautious. Truth of the matter is, they've asked Russia, they've asked Ukraine, and what we've had so far is a deadlock. They saying, oh, the reason why we're not accepting that's Ukraine is because we're not fighting outside of our territory. We're not asking for too much. We're just saying we cannot allow our homes to be taken away from us. Russia is saying we cannot allow you to continue to join forces with our enemy. And so we will do whatever we can so that we can protect our territory, as it were, because what you have done is you have aligned with our enemies and all of that. And so far, no agreements have been arrived at, and that is unfortunate. And I also agree with you that the leaders of this world the world, let me be emphatic about that, should please rise to the occasion and speak on our behalf and demand of both parties that, look, let's come to a truth. Let's stop this. We're just killing our children. We're destroying our future. These are avoidable things that we can do. And I believe going forward, with all the caving in here and there, maybe we'll be able to have situations where they will be more disposed towards accepting the kind of negotiations that have been brought forward over and over again that they've rejected, because unfortunately, that's what has happened. It's not like they've not spoken about this before, but both parties have continued to reject it, and the world is paying for it, children are paying for it, civilians are paying for it, and it's such an unfortunate situation.
Finally, to what has become a conundrum for me, and I'm sure for many who are thinking about it around the world, this drama at the nuclear power plant in Zaporizhia, where both sides are accusing each other of attempting to attack the plant. The Russians, who are in custody of the plant, are accusing the Ukrainians of trying to attack the plant that is in their own country and will cause, obviously, some sort of nuclear incident if it happens. And the Russians themselves, who will not but have to pay for it with loss of life and God knows what else if that power plant is not deemed safe by the IAEA. Your thoughts?
My thought is, again, that is communication war at play. One of the ways to win any war anywhere is to talk big, talk loud, lie little, make it look like you're the one that is winning and all of that. And at the end of the day, that's what is happening. That is what we are experiencing right now. So it is not good for anyone. It's not only the power plant. That is where the most grains are gotten from. So that area is a very sensitive environment. It's a place where we all hope that none of the parties would take a stupid decision that would cause a calamity on the rest of the world. So yes, they are both accusing themselves and they're saying it is you, it is me, it is them, and all of that. But again, that is part of war. You would lie a little. You would say things that are not completely true. You would paint pictures that are seemingly the right pictures, but in some cases are not. So our hope is that this will be dealt with decisively, and at the end of the day, they will not get all of us into the kind of trouble that they have continued to get us in.
Nobody wants a Chernobyl. Thank you so much for your insight, Mr. Alushe Yademo, who joined us from Lagos, Southwest Nigeria, virtually, for your insight.
Thank you so much for having me.
When we come back, Ukraine's President Vladimir Zelensky signs bill adopting sanctions against 18 entities. That's in a moment. Please stay with us. Welcome back. The International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, has requested additional access to parts of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant in southern Ukraine after reports of possible military action around the site intensified. The agency has experts on the ground in Zaporizhzhia who have been monitoring and inspecting the site in recent days and weeks, and so far, they've not found any visible indications of mines or explosives, according to a statement citing the Director General, Rafael Grossi, who stressed the importance of the additional access in view of the situation. In recent days, Moscow and Kyiv have both been warning of an imminent attack on the plant by the other side. Ukrainian President Mr. Vladimir Zelensky has signed a bill that adopts sanctions against 18 entities which he claims are linked to Russia. He said it's in order to block the activity of all individuals and legal entities, which is the foundation of the Russian regime's ability to terrorize Ukraine and the rules-based international order. The legal entities are registered in Russia, Luxembourg, and the Republic of Cyprus. The presidency said Alexei Danilov, the head of Ukraine's National Security and Defense Council, will be responsible for monitoring the implementation of the decision. Now, we're going to join Ini John Meko, who is with us in the studio, to give us a business perspective of the Russian invasion in Ukraine as the lines blur. Ini, good morning.
Good morning.
Bulgaria and Ukraine will sign a memorandum in the field of energy.
Yeah.
Kyiv is interested in the reactors.
Yeah, so it's like a help me, I help you kind of situation. You know, Bulgaria is supporting Ukraine in this war. They've been lending a lot of help as much as they can because they are also not a very rich country. But the difference comes because they used to rely a whole lot on Russia for gas. So obviously they have to look for other ways to get it. Now, Ukraine does have a large reserve of gas. In fact, it has over 1 trillion. But the case with Ukraine is that about 80% of it has been depleted, even though they still have a whole lot more. But report says that it's in areas that are hard to reach. I know with the distraction of the war, it's kind of difficult. So Bulgaria has to look for other ways to get gas. So there's now an interconnector that goes from Greece, connects Greece to Bulgaria. And you know that Ukraine used to serve as a connector also of Russian gas to Europe. You know, they used to have the pipeline that will pass through to Europe. So, but of course, with the war, we know what has happened to all of that relation. So a lot of countries, including Bulgaria in this case, they have to start looking elsewhere for their energy so that they don't support, or it doesn't look like they're supporting the war in one way or the other. And of course, you also know there's also the threat of the secondary sanction. So Bulgaria is looking to help Ukraine more with reactors and all of that. And Ukraine is looking for ways that if they could produce more of their gas also to get to Bulgaria for energy and heat and all of that.
So this presents a dilemma for Bulgaria.
Yes, it does, because it put them in a difficult situation. I mean, they could easily ignore the war and continue getting their gas from Russia, and life will go on. But everybody knows that a war in one country will spread to another, depending on where your border is, or even if it's not. I mean, Nigeria is very far away from Ukraine and Russia, and we see what the war has done to our country, to oil prices. Everybody's affected, to wheat and other grains, you know.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I guess that's why they've decided to take a stance and say, well, we're not going to support the war, and they have to pay for it to start running helter-skelter for other sources of gas.
Indeed, you just mentioned grain. And speaking of which, our last guest, Mr. Adeyemo, just reminded us that Zaporizhia, where the nuclear power plant is located, happens to be a hub for grain as well. So I don't know why the Russians and the Ukrainians appear to be playing Russian roulette with the nuclear power plant. It's not a game.
It's not a game, and it gets scarier every day. I think I read yesterday that Russia has some of its weapons, have moved it close to where the nuclear site is, and all of that.
Yeah.
It obviously is not a game, but I don't know, is it a fight for territory? Is it a fight for ego? You know, sometimes you tend to ask these questions.
How does that affect, how does that brings it into play, rather, the Black Sea grain deal? And I'm asking
Which
that
is
now.
expiring soon.
Yeah, so what will happen? Give me a worst-case scenario if it does expire.
It does expire.
And Russia does not renew.
Not sign. Well, it goes back to the early days of the war, which was when the Black Sea was not functional. Grains were not going through there. Even the little that we talk about, in spite of the disruption, would not be going through. The only difference would be that Ukraine has been able to have an agreement with neighboring European countries, and they will be able to get, even though it's small quantities, get them out through Poland, Hungary, and all of that. So, you know, at the beginning of the war, that avenue was not there. So perhaps that's
so
what...
does that mean that bread will be hard to get for us as well here in Nigeria? We need our...
He's thinking of his own.
We need our bread.
We need our bread, and I know you love bread. I love bread too. Yeah. So I think it's a challenge. Obviously, we will feel the pinch, because it doesn't matter the quantity that goes through the Black Sea, it still gets out there. And because investors and prices rely on sentiment and news, you understand? Once we hear that the grain deal is no longer renewed, is no longer functioning, it affects it. Whether there's more supply or not, it affects it. So we're going to have to feel that pinch. I mean, bread sellers have already said over the weekend in Nigeria that they're going to increase prices again. Again, yes. No. And this in spite of cutting the size, and some of them the taste. You know, so I mean, it concerns everybody. It concerns everybody. The good thing is, in the long term, back here in Nigeria, the federal government has approved new varieties of wheat and all of that, and cassava.
So alternatives.
Alternatives. If Olumide would want to take it, because we tried cassava bread and you guys did not accept it.
Let's see. Ini, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Finally, Russia has accused a small U.S.-based charity of sabotaging the construction of a huge gas pipeline to China and banned it as what it calls an undesirable organization. The Russian Prosecutor General's office, while claiming to advocate nature conservation, said the Altad project was meddling in Russia's internal affairs and it could damage its economic security. Director of the Altai project, Jennifer Kastner, described the accusation as absurd. The move followed clampdowns on many foreign NGOs in Russia, including a similar ban last month on the local arm of the World Wildlife Fund environmental group. And that's it for today's special coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Olumide Macaulay. Many thanks for watching. See you again.